video 3, the beginning of seminar part 3. Some people have asked, well, hey, if God was mad at the world, why would he tell Noah to build a big boat? Why not just make everybody die? Can't God say, okay, I want everybody except Noah and his family to die? And they would die. God could do that. Why use a flood anyway? Why make Noah spend, who knows, some people say it took him 7 years to build the ark. Some people say 120 years. I don't think the Scripture is clear on the topic. It took him a long time to build a boat that size. Why do that? Well, interesting. Things to consider about the flood. The flood left evidence. A miracle would not. You can go all over the world and pick up fossils. There are fossils which are evidence, like this giant trilobite. Something died. This is actually a replica of a fossilized arm to an octopus. Do you realize how unlikely it would be for an octopus to fossilize? They're all soft tissue. Fossilized jellyfish are found. How can that be? Fossilized eggs. We have 3 real dinosaur eggs in our museum. Well, they're here today, but they'll be in the museum tomorrow. Dinosaur eggs. Thousands of and many eggs are found fossilized. What's the chances of an egg fossilizing? You know, like slim to none. And yet there's evidence all over the world that we can pick up today. And Satan knows this ought to draw people to say, wow, there was a flood, there was a disaster, this thing was buried quickly. And Satan has worked very hard to deceive people into thinking that the fossils that testify of God's judgment instead testify of millions of years. Kids go to school for 16 years and they're taught over and over, oh, this is proof for evolution, millions of years. No, this is proof there was a judgment of God. There was a flood. That flood left evidence all over. You can just about any place in the world dig around and find fossils. They're everywhere. Proof of God's judgment. The effects are still here today, but people are misinterpreting that. They're seeing the fossils and thinking millions of years. No, it ought to be thinking God's judgment. When you look at fossils, I like fossils, and man, I see things have changed. There's a reed that grows today, gets about 15 inches tall, little reed. They find fossils of them that used to be 150 feet tall. Something was very different before the flood. I mean, giant plants lived on this planet. Huge coal fields. Something was different. Plus, the flood, instead of a miracle, gave them warning to repent. They could watch Noah building that boat every day. They couldn't watch a miracle coming. He could preach, hey, 10 more days, you're all going to drop over. Yeah, right. But they could see that boat going together day after day. It was a constant reminder that they could have gotten saved. And they could have and should have. So, how could a flood cover the whole world? I was debating at University of West Florida, my first debate I ever had, here in Pensacola about 15 years ago. I'd had a few debates with my wife before that, and I lost those all, so I was not excited about debating this professor, but yeah, you're laughing, you know, don't you guys? I debated this professor, and one of the kids in the audience, we had Q&A time afterwards, he said, Hovind, could it rain enough to cover the earth? He said, you think it really rained enough to cover Mount Everest? He said, don't you know when it rains, the more heat is released? I said, oh yeah, I understand. I taught physics. It's called the latent heat of condensation. He said, well, heat is released when moisture turns to liquid, and if it rained enough to cover Mount Everest, it would completely cook the world. I said, you're right. He said, but you think it rained enough to cover Mount Everest? I said, no, I never said that. No. You're assuming that Mount Everest was there to begin with, and you're assuming all the water came from rain. You got 2 very false assumptions in your thinking here. What about this flood? Several theories about the flood. I'm going to give you the Hovind theory of what I think happened to cause that flood, what triggered it, where did the water come from, where did it go, and what effects can we see today? Now, we cover much on what the original creation was like on Seminar Part 2. The Bible says there was a canopy of water above the atmosphere and water under the crust of the earth. Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's. He founded it upon the seas and established it upon the floods. Psalm 33 says, He layeth up the depth in storehouses. The water used to be under the crust of the earth. Psalm 136, He stretched out the earth above the waters. See, when God first made the world, the crust of the earth was stretched over. Most of the water that's now on top was underneath the crust of the earth. There were vast subterranean water chambers. There are still huge amounts of water, huge water chambers down in the earth. The Japanese drilled down, I forget how far, just recently in early 2003, and they said there's probably more water deep in the crust of the earth than there is on the surface of the earth. Just found earlier this year. There's a whole lot of water down there. Well, the Bible says the fountains of the deep broke open. And it says all of them in one day broke open. Here's what I think happened. The earth has cracks all over it, seams like a baseball. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, the New Madrid Fault, the Golden Fault, the Ring of Fire, none of them my fault, but there's no question the earth is all busted up into plates, and the earth has gone through some really hard times. It's busted up like an eggshell. I think that happened at the time of the flood, not millions of years ago. The Bible says in Job 38, or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? And break for it my decree. He said he put my decreed place. Your proud waves can't go any farther. There's a beach that stops it from coming up here. But the Bible says the water gushed out of the earth like water out of a womb. I delivered one of my kids at home. If you've never seen a baby get born, you need to see that. One of my friends in college, he was up there getting ready. His wife's going to have a baby. She's standing there fixing breakfast, and her water broke. Whoosh, all over the floor. He came running in to see what's going on, and he slipped and broke his arm. She had to drive him to the hospital. Set his arm while I have this kid, would you please? I mean, the water just gushes out sometimes when they have a baby. And God said the water gushed out of the earth when it broke up. I think the plates of the earth broke apart. The fault lines are still there today from what happened during that flood. And the earth is broken up into plates, and the plates are still moving a little bit, which causes earthquakes, volcanoes. You know, I've studied all that stuff, taught water science for years. People say, wait a minute, isn't that proof of Pangea? No, that's not proof of Pangea. Textbooks say all the continents fit together. Well, that's baloney. They don't tell the kids the truth about this. This textbook says South America and Africa seem to be a perfect fit. That's a pure coincidence, folks, based on the water level. Here's the evidence they give to support continental drift. They'll say the shapes of the continent seem to fit. Similar fossils are found on opposite sides of the ocean. Textbook says, see this? Same fossils found in Africa and South America. Well, so what? Those same fossils are actually found all over the world. This is just as much proof of a worldwide flood. How far could the dead animals float in a year? So they point out the two found on opposite sides of the ocean, but they don't point out the same ones are found everywhere. They don't point that out because they're trying to push off a theory on the kids. This is evidence of a flood, not evidence of Pangea. And then they say there are magnetic reversals in the ocean floor. No, there are no magnetic reversals. We'll get into that in a second. They don't tell the kids they shrank Africa nearly 40% to make them fit. If you cut it out get a globe and cut Africa out, and then cut South America out and compare it to what they did in their textbook, they shrank Africa between 35 and 40%. All of Mexico and Central America are gone in the Pangea maps. Señor, ¿qué pasa? ¿Dónde está Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala? They don't tell the kids that Europe and South America rotated one way and Africa was rotated a different way. They also don't tell the kids what I think ought to be obvious to a kindergartner. Did you know if you take the water out of the oceans, you will notice there is dirt underneath? There is. I mean, the oceans actually have a bottom. People say, do you think the continents were connected? I say, what do you mean? Were? They still are. It's just the low places are full of water, that's all. It's not like these are hollow, it's hollow under here and they're floating around like lily pads in a bathtub, The earth has a solid crust, okay? I think the Pangea theory is one of the dumbest theories in the world, but textbooks say there are magnetic reversals. No, there are magnetic reversals. Walt Brown's got a great section in his book about the so-called magnetic reversals, if you want to read more on that. Or go to his website, creationscience.com, or you can get the book through our ministry. Textbooks say these reversals in the magnetic field indicate millions of years of spreading of the ocean floor. Well, I agree the ocean floor is spreading, and I agree the continents are moving, but I don't think it's been millions of years, okay? This is a lie in the textbooks. There aren't really magnetic reversals. There are areas of stronger and weaker magnetism. Here's what happened. They measured the magnetic intensity in the layers of the earth at the middle, especially the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and they found some places were stronger magnetically and some places were weaker. Stronger field, stronger, weaker. So they drew a sine wave. Then somebody drew a line through the middle and called everything below average a reversal. Below average is not reversed. If we line up everybody in the room and find out the average height is 5'7", does that mean everybody less than 5'7" is reversed down in the ground, or are they just less than 5'7"? See, less magnetic intensity does not mean reversed magnetic intensity. There's no place on the ocean floor where a north-seeking compass will point south in relation to the rock. When they drill down, it gets even more jumbled up, as this graph shows from Brian Young's book, Doubts About Creation. Out after this, you can get that through our ministry. How much is that, Dan? Do you remember what we sell that for? $11.95. Excellent book on, I think that's correct. You can get our website on if you have doubts about creation, read that book. It'll straighten them out. Actually, the magnetic field's getting weaker, which indicates the Earth is less than 25,000 years old. Of course, the evolutionists can't have that, okay? But the magnetic field's decline is really a proof for a young Earth. Walt Brown's theory is excellent on the fault lines and how the plates spread about. We'll cover that in a second. Here's Walt Brown's hydroplate theory.
We can see on our planet 17 very strange features which can now be systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 10 billion hydrogen bombs. This explanation shows us just how rapidly major mountains formed. It explains the coal and oil deposits, the rapid continental drift, why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches and hundreds of canyons and volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and most of the fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, but perhaps 9,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, the pre-flood Earth had a lot of subterranean water, about half of what is now in our oceans. This water was contained in interconnected chambers, forming a thin spherical shell about half a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the Earth's surface. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling rupture, fountains of water jetted supersonically, almost 20 miles into the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rains, such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago, which we can now tie together scientifically. Some of the water jetting high above the cold stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced some massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the Earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
The demonstrations you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
All right, that's Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which I think is excellent. A couple key things he talks about in there is that the canyons had to form quickly as lakes overflowed their boundary. But the other thing is about the mid-Atlantic ridge. What would cause that? This picture here shows that if a spring is compressed and you have two bricks on top of it, as the bricks slide apart, all of a sudden the spring's going to pop up in the center. Apparently, the earth was originally created with a layer of dirt for Adam and Eve to grow their stuff in, and then granite. Granite is amazing rock. There's a place right behind the church here that sells, big slabs of beautiful granite for countertops and stuff, and I got these samples from him. This one's from Brazil. Granite apparently was the original basement rock, and it was not formed by melting rock cooling down. Well, Halos.com, Robert Gentry has an excellent book called Creation's Tiny Mystery, which proves granite was never a hot molten mass. It was created instantly, like the Bible says, under water. We covered that on video 7. Under the granite was apparently a layer of water where the subterranean water chambers were, and then a layer of basalt, which is a different kind of rock. The basalt underneath would spring up into the crack as the mid-Atlantic ridge got wider. As these ridges widened, as Walt Brown says, it's going to spring up. The basalt will bounce up in the center, and the plates will slide away. So there was movement of the plates, but that's not proof for Pangaea. Now what happened, as the basalt springs up, it's going to crack, and water's going to fill in the cracks. Now today, they're not only full of water, they're full of sediments. It's been 400 years since the flood. The cracks are gone. They're all full of dirt. But when they measured the magnetic intensity, what they were actually finding were the cracks where the water rushed in. Because as basalt cools down, it stores a stronger magnetic field. If the basalt is hot, it doesn't store a magnetic field. You can put a magnet in your oven, heat it up, it'll lose its magnetic strength. So it's simply finding the cracks where the earth busted up into plates. That's all they're finding. Get the book if you want. Well, he's got a whole section on that in his book here in the beginning. Hot basalt loses its magnetism, and cold basalt stores a strong magnetic field. So that's what they were finding at the bottom of the mid-Atlantic ridge. There are no places where a north-seeking compass points south. Now, it is true there is still a little bit of subduction today, as in, plates of the earth are being drawn under. If you ever cook pudding or something, and it develops a skin on it, sometimes the skin on the pudding all of a sudden will just sink to the bottom. And if you push it down in one place, it'll draw more down with it, okay? I think some of that is happening or has happened with the crust of the earth. Sections have slid down under. Hawaii, for instance, is over a hot spot, and it appears to be moving. I think there is plate subduction right there. But I don't think it's been going on for millions of years. The other factor that really is confusing for evolutionists is when you look at the bottom of the ocean, there's not much sediment down there. All the dirt washes into the oceans. You'd think the oceans would fill up with dirt. But when they check it out, there's only a few thousand years worth of dirt down there. So why don't the oceans have huge layers of really, really deep sediment? Well, one theory is they're not millions of years old. The other theory is, well, it's being recycled, it's being pulled under. That's why this plate movement theory is so important to the evolutionist. They have actually several serious problems they're trying to overcome. We'll cover in a minute. It's true there seems to be a little bit of plate subduction sliding under other plates. I agree. It's true the earth is busted up. We have fault lines. I agree. That doesn't prove it's been going for millions of years. The plates are moving, but it doesn't prove time, okay? And it doesn't prove the rate we see today has always been the same. I think Walt Brown's hydroplate theory is excellent. As the water's escaping from underneath, it's going to provide lubrication to slide these things faster. Today, there's very little water left down there. And students, I think, ought to be taught there are other options to this one silly theory. We live right here in Pensacola, Florida. My place is 2.6 miles south of Interstate 10 off Highway 29. If I go up to the interstate and stand there and I watch somebody headed east toward Jacksonville, does that prove he started in Los Angeles 4 days ago? No, they might have just got on at the next exit down there, right? The fact that we see the plates moving does not prove anything as far as time. Here's the flaw in their logic. They look at the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean spreading about 3 centimeters a year, about an inch, a little over an inch a year it is spreading. And they'll say, see, look at the distance across there. It's so many thousand miles and 1 inch a year. That proves, blah, 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 millions of years. That proves you're making some assumptions in your calculations. That's all that proves, okay? Plus, they're forgetting the continental shelf, and forgetting the shapes of the continents is just a pure coincidence. If you raise the water 600 feet, from here to the highway, Chicago is underwater. The oceans average 12,000 feet deep. Just a 600-foot change would put Chicago underwater. We'll show more on that in the second session here. Continental drift theory in the textbooks is trying to avoid 2 embarrassing problems. Number 1, the magnetic field's getting weaker, saying the earth is young, and there's not much dirt in the bottom of the ocean, saying the earth is young. Those are 2 evidences of a young earth that they're trying desperately to avoid with their continental drift theory. Okay, so what about the ice age? Is it true that the earth was covered with ice? Well, maybe not the whole earth, but there was ice all the way down to Kansas City, Missouri. I was just up in I've just been everywhere. I was in British Columbia day before yesterday. someplace where they have these large terminal moraines and drumlins, big, huge piles of rocks. You know, as I studied this for years in earth science, it's fascinating to see ice, when it melts back, leaves behind a pile of rocks. When I was in Washington climbing Mount Rainier, my sister lives out there, they had a picture of this huge pile of rocks and somebody standing on top of it in front of this big glacier. They're going to get their picture taken. You know, the man's up there standing on this massive pile of big boulders, you know, and he's smiling, not realizing, you know why that pile of boulders is there? They're coming off the top of that glacier. So his wife takes the picture just as one about the size of a basketball falls down just behind his head from about 130 feet up. If that would hit him on the head, he'd have to open his shirt to eat the rest of his life, man. Glaciers leave behind piles of rocks when they melt back. If it's on the side, it's called a lateral moraine. If it's in front, it's called a terminal moraine. But there's no question there is obvious evidence the Earth had an ice age. All over Ohio and Indiana, from a famous drumlin where ice carved around a hill is Bunker's Hill or Breed's Hill, where the Revolutionary War started. That's formed by ice. There's no question there was an ice age, but the question is, where does it fit into the Bible? And was it really millions of years ago? As these glaciers plow ahead, they leave behind all these rocks, and they melt back, and the rocks stay there. And all over places in Illinois and Ohio, you see these piles. If you dig down in, you hit big boulders. And they're usually rounded, smooth boulders. So what caused the ice age? We're going to cover that in the Hovind theory. And what froze the mammoths? Those big, hairy, hippie elephants that are found frozen, standing up sometimes, food still in their mouth. The Beresovka mammoth, found in 1901, was a famous one. Part of the trunk and front foot had been eaten by wolves, apparently, but the rest of it was still frozen in the ground. They dug it out, it's in a museum in Russia. How do you freeze an elephant standing up? And it's not just one, I mean many thousands. In 1 year, they removed 20,000 pairs of tusks. 1 year. It's called fossil ivory. This is one right here, a small one from a baby one. I've got a friend in Alaska that goes over to Siberia, and he buys and trades in fossil ivory. He carves things out of it. Amazing, beautiful little carvings out of, you know, ancient ivory that was frozen. Well, how do you freeze an elephant? It's not just one. Walt Brown's got a page in his book here about the map showing where all the different frozen mammoth and frozen rhinoceros are found, frozen camels near the North Pole, frozen bobcat. What happened? How do you explain this from a biblical worldview? Well, some of the mammoths are frozen standing up, not all of them. So they have undigested food still in their stomach and still in their teeth. They didn't even swallow their last bite. They died of suffocation. There's no water found in the lungs. And the small ice crystals in the blood indicate they probably froze in less than 5 hours. How do you freeze an elephant in less than 5 hours? I got curious about this, so I called Bird's Eye Frozen Food people in New York. I called physics professors, I called meat packers, I called everybody I could think of, butchers that might have an answer. And I said, how on earth would you freeze an elephant? I said, when I called Bird's Eye, I talked to one of the scientists there, I said, if I stuck an elephant in the freezer, what would happen? It was silence on the other end of the line. He said, you'd have a crowded freezer. I said, well, yeah, I know that. But I said, how long would it take to freeze an elephant? He said, well, normal freezers are about, 10 below, maybe 10 above, 0. Probably take about 5 hours to freeze an elephant. I said, well, that's not going to work. I got to freeze my elephant in, he said it'd probably take about 5 days. I'm sorry. He said it'd take about 5 days to freeze an elephant. I said, that's not going to work because the food in the stomach's going to rot in 5 days. The acid's still working. It doesn't know he's dead. All it knows is it's acid. It's supposed to break this stuff down. I said, I need to freeze my elephant in 5 hours. They said, well, then you're going to have to find something 300 below 0, like liquid nitrogen. Well, it never gets 300 below 0 on Earth. The coldest it has ever gotten. Here's a map from National Geographic. They said the coldest temperature on Earth is minus 127. That's pretty chilly. I was up in Barrow, Alaska a few months ago where it gets to 80 below 0. That's chilly. But that's still not cold enough to freeze the mammoths. What happened? I talked to a guy when I was up in Alaska. He said, he told me he works in the oil field drilling for oil near Barrow. He said they drill down 1,000 feet through permanently frozen ground, permafrost, and hit trees. He said one day they were drilling and hit a tree, and they always take whatever they drill out and lay it on the ground beside them to go, develop a sample of what's down in the ground. He said they drilled straight through the top of a tree that was 300 feet tall, standing up. This is on the north slope of Alaska. Folks, I was just up there. There are no trees. We saw one tree growing in a Chinese restaurant inside, about this big. That's it. There are no trees in Barrow, Alaska. There are certainly no trees 300 feet tall. There are very few trees in the world 300 feet tall. Some of the redwoods are that size, but how do you get 300-foot tree standing up under 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground? What happened? Well, I'm going to give the Hovind theory of what I think caused the flood in the days of Noah. We're going to give this in the next session mostly. I just give you a few things to consider. Now, many people have contributed to this. I'll take the blame for it if it's wrong. It's just a theory. Some people say, I think your theory wrong about this little point. Okay, then modify the theory. That's what it's for. It's to give you a skeleton to hang the meat on, okay? We're going to review a little science and then give you the Hovind theory. There's a law called the inverse square law, which says if two objects are attracted to each other, like the Earth and the Moon have gravity pulling them together, or two magnets, the force of attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. In English, that means if you brought it into 1/2 the distance, it would quadruple the attraction, not double it. Inverse square laws apply when you're dealing with forces involving gravity, light, magnetism, and girls. See, when you half the distance, the attraction is quadrupled, not doubled. Many guys don't understand that. See, I travel every week. I've been home 7 Sundays in the last 14 years, which means I get to come home every week. I get 10 feet away from my wife, and it's, hello, dear, how are you doing? When you get 5 feet away, it's 4 times the attraction, not 2. When you get real close, it's just too late, okay? Overpowers all resistance at that distance. So stay 10 feet away, guys. Your problems will be solved. Anyway, next thing you need to consider, when a top is spinning, it behaves in a very peculiar way. If a spinning object is struck by something, like a gyroscope, if you bump it, it'll wobble for a while and then recover spinning, but it'll be spinning at a strange angle. Spinning tops follow actually a very predictable pattern when they're struck by something. Like gyroscopes, or with the bicycle wheels full of water that we have at Dinosaur Adventure Land. Come over their entire thing with our bicycle wheels. That you get them spinning, and it's very hard to change the spin. But they follow a predictable path. You can actually determine when it was struck by tracing back the wobbling pattern and say, oh, it must have got hit right here. Okay? The Earth obviously has had different north poles. The Earth, the Earth, they build your globes, it's tilted over 23.5 degrees. Oh, it spins this way, actually. But it's tilted 23.5 degrees. It wasn't always that tilt. There's quite a bit of evidence on this planet that the Earth had different tilts. Stonehenge, for instance, probably was built at a time to worship the sun or study the sun, but the Earth had a different tilt when Stonehenge was built. Same with Edixus and Amun-Ra. George Dodwell was the government astronomer for Australia for years, back from 1909 to 1950-something. He was the main astronomer for the government of Australia. He spent years studying the tilt of the Earth from historical data. He says the Earth was tilted differently down through time. He made a graph of the tilt of the Earth when the Earth is moving. He said the Earth angle of declination in relation to its orbit around the sun is changing. He said after studying all this, it looked to him like something struck the Earth 4,350 years ago and made the Earth wobble for several thousand years. And now it's pretty stable. The North Pole's still moving a little bit, but basically it's pretty stable. But did something strike the Earth 4,350 years ago? Well, that's about the time of the biblical flood, What happened? Today we're tilted over, and that's what causes the seasons. The Bible talks about summer and winter. The first mention of cold weather is after the flood, Genesis chapter 8. I know there were seasons before. There was apparently no cold weather before. So keep that thought in mind. Third thing, some of the planets have craters on them. The moon obviously has craters all over the place. Mercury has craters. Many of these, Mars has craters. What happened? What caused the craters on these planets? Mars has a canyon bigger than Grand Canyon, and there's not a drop of water to be found to be proven on Mars. And there's a canyon bigger than Grand Canyon. And this article says it was carved in an almost instant Grand Canyon when a lake overflowed. Now, why can they look at a canyon on Mars and determine it was formed very quickly, and they can't look at Grand Canyon on Earth and can't determine that was formed very quickly? Here you got plenty of water on Earth, almost no water on Mars. What's their logic here? And we talk all about it in this article here. You can read for yourself about the canyon on Mars forming very quickly as a lake overflowed. I agree. I think many canyons form quickly. There's an effect in physics called the Meissner effect. A magnet will actually float on top of another magnet. If you put two north poles together, one will float on top of the other. Japanese use this for their high-speed maglev trains. The Meissner effect. The All this is going to tie in what we call the Hovind theory, but you need to have a little refresher in science here. What caused all this? There are comets flying around through space, but these comets are extremely cold, like 300 to 400 below zero. Don't lick them. How many of you have a piece of your tongue stuck to a pipe or a pump handle someplace in the world right now because when you were a kid, you were as dumb as me? Okay? My brother said, I bet you can't lick that pole. I bet I can. 10 below zero in Illinois, you know. Super cold things exist in space, cold enough to freeze the mammoths. Next week, we're going to cover some more of the Hovind theory of what caused the freezing of the mammoths, the Ice Age, and the flood, and Grand Canyon, and all that. So tune in again next time. See you then.